Thanks everyone for having me here. Also want to acknowledge the traditional owners and pay respects to elders past and present, and to say hello to fellow MPs. I've seen David here, ex-MP from Victoria, Sue, who's come up here, Sue Pennicue. I don't know if there's any other MPs, but if there's any others and councillors in the room, nice to be here with you. Climate change, I think, was following on a lot from what the end of the last panel said, was high in Australians' consciousness going into the election. And I know there's been a lot of debate about the accuracy of polling, but I think I haven't heard anyone suggest that the more qualitative as well as the quantitative pollsters got it wrong when they plotted a rise of concern about climate change in the lead up to the election. And I think it's no coincidence that we'd just lived through the hottest summer on record in Australia, and we'd seen 1 million fish dying, and we'd had January being not only the hottest January on record, but the hottest month on record. And at the same time as there were significant floods, parts of Tasmanian forest that had been there since Gondwana land were burnt, and this isn't forest that is used to regeneration from bushfire. This is forest that's never seen fire. All of that, I think, contributed to a very rapid rise in a way that wasn't there 12 months before the election. A very rapid rise in, I think, popular understanding and popular consciousness about the importance of climate change and the importance of action on climate change, even to the point where after the election, when the unexpected result, which we'll talk a bit about in a moment, when the Governor-General comes in and gives a speech, which is basically the government writes for it, that's the convention, the Governor-General comes in and says, here's what the government is going to do. And I presumed, like the previous two speeches, there was going to be no mention of climate change in this. But not only was there a mention of climate change, there was a mention that climate change is an urgent problem, or that urgent action needs to be taken on it. And that followed Scott Morrison kind of pretending to care about climate change for those last 2 weeks before, or 2 to 3 weeks before the election. Like, you actually listened to what, and part of that was that there were some real crunch points, including in places like some of the seats like Warringah, but also seats, maybe North Sydney here. So in areas that I'm more familiar with, you had Josh Frydenberg in Kooyong spending $1 million to keep his seat, writing letters to everyone talking about how much he cares about climate change and so on. And it was really, and there were seats like Higgins as well. And I think Warringah is interesting too, because you had someone running there who had virtually the same policies as the Liberals on economic issues, but on climate change wasn't just saying, I want an emissions trading scheme or I want more technology. Her climate change position was actually more in line with the science than Labor. It's more radical, I guess, if you want to call it that, than Labor. Who's saying stop Adani, right? Which not even Labor can bring itself to say. So you had this, which I think is an interesting thing, that to say, well, not only that climate is a popular thing, so I better be saying something about climate, but that she chose her climate positioning to be further to the more scientific and more emergency side than Labor's. And that Liberal voters were prepared to support that. Liberal voters voted for that. So that is, I think, all confirms that the climate change is certainly an important point in the election. And I think that's important because those tensions, and we'll talk a bit about this in a moment, are going to continue to play out inside the Liberal Party and inside the Labor Party and inside the body politic. But it's also important because we are, as you will see by some of the latest coverage of the fires in the Amazon rainforest, for example, but the fact is that the Arctic has been burning and producing a smoke cloud as big as the European Union. We are really at the point where we're on the verge of collapse, and we've been told that by the world scientists at the end of last year in the IPCC report. They said we'd already warmed by a degree. If you want to stay below 1.5 degrees, the bad news is that 1.5 degrees could come as soon as 2030, right? 2030. So we're not talking our kids' lifetime or our grandkids' lifetime anymore. We're talking about ours. And we're talking about, so the Pacific Islanders saying, well, we want you to stay below the 1.5 degree limit, which means keeping all, at least 80% of all known fossil fuel reserves in the ground. They're talking about this as a potential tipping point that they can see coming in 10 years' time. Right? So this is the scale of the urgency. So it was good in that respect that climate was something that was in people's mind. The election result, in many respects, was unexpected. We don't have to discuss here and now, we don't have time to discuss why it turned out the way that it did. But what that meant, in the context where climate was clearly a thing playing on people's minds and in the discussion, along with many, many other things, of course, as well, it prompted a discussion immediately after the election about, oh, well, how do you explain the election result? If climate was that important, how do you explain the election result? And one of the things that happened immediately after the election is that springing into action was the coal lobby to come up with an explanation. And what you still find, every party's doing its election review and is trying to explain what happened and why, and everyone's got their own theories, some are more valid than the others. The coal lobby wasted absolutely no time and jumped in immediately after the election and through its mouthpieces in Liberal and Labor parties, but especially people like George Christensen up in Queensland and Matt Canavan, our resources minister, jumped in and said, well, this election shows there's a mandate for coal, right? They jumped in and said, this election shows you that there's a mandate for coal. And look at that, it shows you that because everyone was talking about Adani, but look at the result that we've got, and everyone was talking about climate change, but look at the result that we've got. So we've got a mandate for coal. And they've been pressing that really, really hard. Interestingly, Morrison hasn't said anything on that front yet. He's leaving it up to the Canavans and the like to go and run the argument. But they're out there running the argument. A big problem with it is it's not actually supported by the facts. In some of those seats in Queensland, as I think we were talking about, I heard some people saying at the last session, in the seat of Flynn, the Coalition's vote went up 0.8%. In the seat of Dawson, George Christensen's seat, the LNP vote went up 0.32%, right? If you can get yourself a mandate from saying you've got a swing of 0.32%, that's a very interesting definition of mandate. And in Shortland, here in New South Wales, the Lib vote, the LNP vote went up 2%, the Animal Justice Party vote went up more than the Liberal Party vote in the seat of Shortland. And of course you've got Warringah, where we've had the result that we had. It doesn't matter though that it's not supported by the facts, because the coal lobby is going to keep prosecuting it because it's in their interest to do so. But so successful were they in jumping out of the starting box, quick smart, to come up with this explanation for the election result, that they've actually managed to spook the ALP, and the ALP swallowed it hook, line and sinker. Right? And so the ALP is out there now at the moment. One of the first things that happened in this new parliament was that Joel Fitzgibbon from your fine state and George Christensen, I'm pretty sure it was George Christensen, maybe it was Craig Kelly, set up the Parliamentary Friends of Australian coal exports, right? And so, I kid you not, that's bipartisanship took like 20 seconds to reassert itself on the climate question. In Queensland today, they've got the Labor State Conference going on, where the reports are that they're putting forward a pro-coal platform. Jim Chalmers, the new Shadow Treasurer, the Deputy, has come out and said that he sees a vision of Australia where there's more coal mines, right? This is what he has said. And you've got Richard Marles, who's the new Deputy, who said before the election that coal was in the decline and that was a good thing, has now done a mea culpa and said, oh, I'm really sorry, I should never have said that, we need more coal. And you've now got Joh Bjelke-Palaszczuk saying that we are going to pass new laws, will take no action on climate change, but severe action against people who protest about climate change, right? And it's a return to Joh that is happening up there. Let's make no mistake. In defence of the fossil fuel industry, they are now saying we're going to criminalise people who protest against it. And then, of course, you would have seen last week with the Pacific Island Forum, all of this, as I say, these tensions that are very real are now starting to play themselves out, and Morrison knows that, and the government knows that these are tensions that are only going to increase, right? And so he goes to the Pacific Island Forum, doesn't talk about how good coal is, but instead even he understands he has to say that we're tackling climate change, right? So he goes up and lies about that and says we're tackling climate change. But of course he's not going to sign up to something, and let's be clear about what the Pacific Islands were asking for. They were asking for Australia to come up with Australia just to open no new coal mines and then come up with a plan to phase out existing ones. So it's not stop it all tomorrow, but it was like come up with that. That was a bridge too far for him. And then Anthony Albanese and Penny Wong backed him in and said, yes, we wouldn't have signed up to that either. right? So you've got this disjuncture where everyone's saying we're committed to the Paris Agreement of 1.5 degrees, but no one is prepared to take the action that's required. And the two major parties are drifting further and further away from popular consciousness. They're going to, it seems, try and reorient everything towards what they think is going to win them votes in some of these places like Queensland and some seats in New South Wales. What does this mean? Well, it means for us, we will continue to fight in Parliament, but we can't rely on Parliament. That's always been the case, but it's especially the case under this government, especially the case with the composition of the Senate. We will have difficulty, for example, even getting up Senate inquiries into the things that we think are important. Because for votes to be successful in this new Senate, one nation needs to support them in effect. That's the situation that we are in at the moment. We will push for a declaration of climate emergency, as many other countries have done, and that's going to be something that we're going to progress with over the next couple of weeks and months. But we know that in many respects we are up against a unity ticket of Labor and Liberal in this Parliament, especially in these early months where it seems Labor swallowed the coal line with line and sinker. And of course that means that it's no surprise that, given all of that, you don't just have to be close to politics to realise this. Everyone hears this is what's going on, and so we're seeing the very excellent rise of social movements in the form of Extinction Rebellion, but also in the form of the climate strike. And I think we will certainly be saying we support non-violent direct action. It is something that is absolutely critical. It's especially going to be critical in this period of government for the reasons that I've just outlined in terms of where this government's going to go. I think the climate strike in particular is very, very important. We'll be, I'll just see if I can, we've got a bunch of posters that we'll be sending around that look like that, sort of Greens branded posters to support the strikes. We'll be sending through to you in soft copy form so that you can add in the details of wherever the strike is happening nearest to you, and then run through the printer and get out as much as you can, because I think we really need to build the climate strike to make it, on the 20th of September, to make it as big as we possibly can. But we also, and I want to finish on this, say we have to do a bit more of a sustainable piece that picks up on what was, or a bit more of a detailed piece that's important politically that picks up on what was said about the Green New Deal at the end of the last session. Because although the swings weren't to the LNP in some of those seats that we mentioned, as someone pointed out in the Q&A session, there were swings in those seats, but they were away from Labor and to One Nation. Right? And so in Hunter, you saw the One Nation vote go up, or Labor vote went down by 14, One Nation vote went up by 21%, right? So in the seat of Dawson, the Labor vote went down by 12 and the One Nation vote went up by 13. Okay, so they're not switching, this isn't like this massive swing to get in behind the government. It's people switching over to One Nation, and I think there's to say that it only happened because of coal. Yes, that's what the coal lobby wants to say, and let's not forget Palmer in this. Palmer's involved in some very sizable swings in all of this with his massive spend. But I disagree that it's about coal. Yes, they were pro-coal, but I don't think you can just draw one single thing from that part of their policy. But I do think it is probably fair to say that there is an issue of jobs. Right? And what we've got to do is separate the issue, is acknowledge that the issue of jobs is important, but separate the issue of jobs from the issue of coal. Because if we keep the two tied together, like the Queensland branch of the Mining and Energy Division of the CFMEU did, by making Labor candidates sign pledges around Adani, for example, like that in my mind, that was kind of the equivalent of the 2004 moment when union officials stood next to John Howard and hugged him for logging in Tasmania, right? Like, I think that so long as jobs is seen as only defending existing jobs that are there, bearing in mind that Adani is going to be largely automated and there's not going to be jobs in coal mining in the future and so on. But for so long as they think jobs is that, this script is going to play itself out every election. Is Adani this time? It'll be a Clive Palmer coal mine or a Gina Reinhardt coal mine at the next election. Until there is a fundamental break in those seats where you can be pro-jobs but in favour of phasing out of coal, with a really concrete and believable plan. Until that happens, I think the coalition's going to stay in power for a very long time, certainly in those seats, right? Unless we win enough seats around the rest of the country to overshadow Queensland, that is a real risk. And I think that what level of detail we need in terms of a Green New Deal and in terms of a plan, I don't know, but one of the things that I think has to happen is that it has to be believable. And it doesn't have to be a new energy job. It could be, we are going to build a rail line through the electorate or connect it up, and it is going to involve X jobs. We're going to move a government department to this area. We are going to build a new university in this thing. But we need some really tangible, concrete things that everyone on the non-conservative side of politics can sign up to, because then we can say that's what you need to get behind. That's what Labor needs to get behind. That's what the unions need to get behind. But if we stick with where we are at the moment, our movement will grow, but I'm worried that we'll be up against a parliament that is in continual climate denial mode for a very long time.
So just to introduce Jim Stanford, he's an economist, author of the book Economics for Everyone, A Short Guide to the Economics of Capitalism. He hails from Canada, but is now resident in Australia, and I'm very happy to welcome him to our Reboot the Future conference to speak about his work. So this was actually a really nice segue from what Adam was saying about jobs and the importance of that, of how we deal with that issue in the future. What is the future of work? What's the future of employment? How is it going to look for workers and the people who depend on workers, the people who live on the wages of work? That is something that is already, as we've seen with job insecurity, has already been changing and changes to the structure of our industries. And so let's have a look at and hear about how that's going to pan out for the next few years so we can plan our strategies. Dr. Jim Stanford.
All right, Kathy, thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for having me as part of this great day. Kathy, I do have to say, if our goal is to combat depression, despondency, and denial, the last thing you should do is invite an economist. It's known as the dismal profession, the dismal science, and with good reason. I often feel like the Grim Reaper showing up at social movement events like this one to throw the numbers and everything out there. They also say an economist is someone who's good with numbers and didn't have the personality to become an accountant. All the more reason to rethink the agenda. Now, I've got all my charts and graphs lined up as any good, self-respecting economist would, but they clearly wouldn't work on that screen. So I'm going to leave the PowerPoint with you, and you can post it or distribute it as you like, and then I'll expose the dirty truth, which is we use PowerPoints not to actually show you anything, but to remind ourselves what we're supposed to say next. So I've got mine right here. I actually was going to go through four major points. Number one, again, speaking briefly about the election. I'm not a political analyst who can read the tea leaves and all that, but I do want to touch on how I do think that in this area of work and the future of work and fairness of work, progressives won the debate. Even if we didn't win the election for all kinds of reasons, I think we won the debate and are shifting the goalposts and are continuing to win the debate. And in the long run, that's going to allow us to win. Secondly, why we still need labour law reform and labour policy reform after the election, even though the prospects of making change on that issue, as on the climate issue, as Adam just said, are remote in this parliament, but we still need it. The issue is still there. Third, I want to talk about what the coalition is now suddenly going to do in this area. They didn't say boo about labour issues and work and industrial relations in the election, but now that they, to their own surprise, as well as everyone else's, are in power, they're going to invent an agenda and follow it to the max. And frankly, those of us on the left could learn from those experiences on the right. When they get power, they use it. And they use it in a way dramatically and unforgivingly. And then finally, my conclusion is stay calm and keep campaigning. Elections are one moment in politics, but politics is much more than elections. Politics happens all the time, and I think that we've got a lot of capacity and hope, frankly, to keep shifting those goalposts and ultimately win. So In terms of the debate, I was really impressed. I've only been in Australia for a few years, but I was really impressed at this very vigorous, focused, and I think disciplined movement that sprung up. The ACTU, I thought, did a great job around with its Change the Rules campaign. I know they're debating the slogan Change the Rules now and whether there's a different vision for it, but in terms of all the things you expect for in a social movement campaign, which is to identify a problem, educate people about what's gone wrong, mobilize them and provide them with hope, and keep it focused and ambitious and disciplined. I thought it was tremendous. It was one of the best campaigns in the world, frankly, in terms of mobilizing people. That demonstration in Melbourne, but other events and grassroots education, of course, translating that into success at the ballot box is where we didn't do the job. The election was supposed to be a referendum on wages. Shorten at one point early in the campaign said this election will be a referendum on wages, and I hoped that would be the case, given the groundwork that had been laid to expose the problems that are happening in the labour market with insecure work and wage theft and wage stagnation. Unfortunately, it turned out to be a referendum on taxes, really, I think, is how the debate got completely sidetracked, partly again because of the Palmer money and the fake news. Astounding what happened on the fake news in terms of some of the just sheer lies that the right put out, and something we have to learn about and fix, because our democracy is at risk if they can continue to get away with things like they did on this death tax and other outright lies. Unfortunately, the same thing is happening in the realm of taxes as is happening in the realm of climate, of people getting exactly the wrong lesson from the election and saying, well, then we shouldn't talk about taxes anymore. And we did a lot of work in our center showing how trivial and meaningless these ginormously promoted tax cut ideas that came from the coalition in its pre-election budget, how they would make zero difference to the real standard of living of working people. Someone making $80,000 a year, for example, we showed you get your $550 once from this tax cut that they introduced. Compare the benefits of that to what happens if you actually fixed labour markets and got back to a situation where people got a raise every year. What a concept that you'd get a raise every year, and the benefits of that is that it compounds year after year after year. The tax cut only happens once. So even after 3 years, just 3 years, that $80,000 worker has 10 times as much additional disposable income as they do from the tax cut. And then, of course, is the other important issue that you don't get anything really on a net basis from the tax cut anyway, because what they're giving you in money, they're taking away ultimately in terms of your program. So absolutely false. And the idea that this can somehow solve the problem, somehow compensate workers for the lack of a wage increase, well, at least we'll let you keep more of your money, is a mathematical lie, and politically it's extremely dangerous. And it's also extremely dangerous how now people in other parties are being sucked into that argument and say, well, okay, we'll support tax cuts too, but it has to be, you know, for working class people. That's nonsense. What working class people need is not a tax cut, it's a wage increase. And that's where we have to go. The issue, my second point, the issue and the urgency of fixing labour markets is as clear as ever. In fact, things are going to get worse before they get better. In terms of wage stagnation, underemployment, and so on. And again, I'll refer you to the work that we've done on many aspects of the crisis in labour markets at our website. futurework.org.au is our website. All our work is open access because property is theft and intellectual property is intellectual theft. So get it all for free there. And we've looked at the wage crisis, for example. This has been the worst period of time, the last 6 years, dating back to 2013. That's when the coalition got back in, of course. That's one of several factors why. It's not purely the coalition's fault. There's many other things happening. But the period since 2013, the absolute worst period for wage growth in Australia's post-war history. No doubt about it. Nominal wage growth has plunged off a cliff to something around 2% per year. The measures differ. There's actually other measures than the one you usually read about in the headlines from the ABS that suggests it's growing at less than 2% a year. That means there's been no increase in real standard of living in 6 years, despite the potential and the growing productivity and the efficiency and the value added and the innovation that we're capable of. It's all being wasted. And That stagnation in living standards, the disappearance of the reality of a fair go for all, the contrast between the lived reality of people and the crumbling dream of a sort of middle class inclusive prosperity, I think is behind the frustration in working class communities, including in those electorates in Queensland, but across the board. And I agree with Adam wholeheartedly. If we can go to them with a pragmatic, meaningful, detailed vision for how their work lives could be improved with decent, secure work, then we'll win the debate. I think that's more important than ever. It's not just wages, of course. There's many factors as to why wages have stagnated. One is the growing emergency, the disappearance really of collective bargaining in Australia's labour market, particularly in the private sector. The numbers are absolutely dramatic. You've seen a decline in the number of workers in private sector firms covered by an enterprise agreement of 40% since 2013. This is like a historic change that's happening very, very quickly, and I don't think people have cottoned on to it. Public sector collective bargaining has been more stable. In the private sector, employers don't want to do it anymore, in part because they've learned through the Fair Work Commission that you can't use a collective agreement to undercut the minimum standards that workers should have in an award. Go figure, hey, what a concept. An amazing idea that the collective agreement is actually supposed to make things better, right? And other factors at play, and the union movement, despite its efforts in the sort of very unbalanced labor law regime that we have, hasn't been able to force employers and keep their feet to the fire in most cases to maintain collective bargaining. So that's one clear reason that wages are going nowhere. Another is the lack of adequate work. I know the unemployment rate doesn't seem that high. It's 5.2%, and people will say, what are you whining about? But the unemployment rate is just the tip of the iceberg, really. There's millions of Australians who are working a few hours but are dramatically underemployed. There's millions more who would like to work but don't believe a job is available, so they don't actively seek one to the satisfaction of the ABS statisticians. To count as unemployed, you actually have to be putting in several active job applications a week. And if you live in a community where there aren't any, why would you bother, right? After all, the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And if you put in 39 applications and just got 39, I call them FOAD letters, fuck off and die letters, back from the employers, why would you put in the 40th, right? So conveniently, then you disappear from the unemployment statistics. That's helpful for the government. Also, the quality of work, the decline in the quality of work, the growth of precarious work to become a normal feature of the whole labor market. By our research, we've looked at not just casualization, a lot of debate about the importance of casual work, but other forms of precarious work, including part-time work, temporary jobs, so-called self-employment or independent contractors, and now gigs. By our measure now, under 50% of employed Australians have a traditional standard job, that is a full-time permanent job, waged with normal benefits, normal entitlements like paid vacation, under 50%. So precarious work is the norm, and when you're in a precarious job, you've got zero bargaining power. The employer doesn't even have to fire you, they just don't renew your contract if you had the gall to go in and ask for a raise. So it's no mystery why wages are going nowhere and why income inequality is growing. My third point is now we've magically out of thin air seen a very quick coming together of an agenda for so-called reform from the coalition in the whole industrial relations area. They were silent on this issue in the campaign, and that is testament to the fact that we did win the battle of ideas about the state of labor markets. They knew it would be a vote loser to go out there and talk about the things that they wanted to do to IR, so they kept their mouths shut about it until suddenly they're in power, and now they and the business lobbyists have very quickly cobbled together an agenda that they have the nerve to call reform. This is one thing I've got to say. They should be struck by lightning, really, when they say reform in regards to something like this. Like I grew up thinking reform was something good, like you had a problem and you made it better. This is some kind of invoking of this economic rationalist mantra that has disproportionate strength in Australia for all kinds of unique historic reasons. And because of the Productivity Commission, frankly, I think is half the problem. But this idea that reform means tough love and, you know, getting the market perfect and that kind of thing. So that's how they're invoking the term reform. It's going to include more attacks on unions, like this integrity bill that we're seeing, which frankly is more about ideology than about economic reality. It's a terrible thing, but it's not going to make any significant difference in the labor market. Other things that I think would make more difference, the power to sack. They want to bring back some of Howard's measures that made it easier for employers to get rid of employees. They also want to go back to a Howard-type vision on enterprise bargaining in the private sector. They want to get rid of this better off overall test that has been finally being implemented in a more rigorous way by the Fair Work Commission. So now they just want to get rid of it so they can go back to, in the name of flexibility, negotiating also in scare quotes, non-union enterprise agreements. That always struck me as a contradiction in terms, a non-union enterprise agreement. It sort of sounds like jumbo shrimp, you know, or military intelligence, you know, or clean coal, of course. How do you negotiate something? It means you're jumping from one side of the table to the other as the employer, saying these are going to be the terms of it, and they want to be able to use these agreements to undercut standards that workers would be entitled to without any enterprise agreement whatsoever. So it's absolutely nonsense, but they're really going after it. And then they're also going to have an attack on superannuation, in particular unions' role in superannuation through the industry funds, and it's kind of the last vestige of the legitimacy of trade unions as a social partner in Australia, and the coalition wants to go after that as well. In terms of the impact of this agenda, it's not going to solve the problem of wage stagnation and underemployment, far from it. Wages will get weaker if employers are given more power, as this agenda would do. And we're already seeing a significant weakening in the macroeconomic environment with slower growth, higher unemployment, even official unemployment, and reduced job vacancies. So both because of the incremental impact of this policy and, more importantly, just the continuing unraveling of the neoliberal vision of managing the macroeconomy, we're definitely going to see things get weaker before they get stronger. I'm not of the worse is better school, right? I've never believed that when people are treated worse, they'll suddenly rise up. But it certainly means that we have as much space, economic and political space, to go out and continue winning the battle of ideas over the need for fair work and fair treatment than we did before the election. So just to conclude, what do we do now? I think we carry on. That's why my slogan was stay calm and campaign on. Again, the election was obviously disappointing in all kinds of ways, but we'd still have to be fighting these fights even if the election outcome had been different, let me assure you. If Shorten was the Prime Minister right now, we know the powers that be in society would be trying to block what we need to do anyways. So, without being too, glass half full about it, we have to just do what we were doing and keep doing it and keep doing it better. We have to carefully document the extent and causes and consequences of the crisis in labor markets, the problems of inadequate quantity of work, the problem of the deteriorating quality of work, wage stagnation, and the absence of collective voice and democratic rights for workers in workplaces. We have to flesh out our concrete policy agenda. We've had some discussion, for example, badly needed discussion in Australia in the last year about enterprise bargaining and extending it to industry-wide or multi-employer bargaining, recognizing the inability of the system, small workplace by small workplace, to make the sort of progress that's required. So we need some kind of sector-wide or industry-wide approach, but we have a lot of work to do to describe exactly how that would work. And then work on our narrative and how we tell the story, how we tell this story to people, including working class people in regional Queensland. I absolutely reject the idea that somehow Labor's whole platform ignored the needs of blue-collar workers. I haven't seen a platform in a generation that would have been more beneficial for blue-collar workers than their relatively progressive, comprehensive vision for labor market reform, true labor market reform. Obviously, something went wrong in how that was communicated and how it was overwhelmed by an opposing narrative. But we have to work on communicating and connecting with working class people, not by somehow pretending that they're all aspirational and they'll all benefit from a tax cut and they've all got 5 investment properties, so we better keep negative gearing in place anyways. That's just, if I can use the technical term, that's just bullshit. Bullshit is a technical term in economics. It means hypothesis unsubstantiated by empirical verification. Okay? Just to define the terms. I think we can, we'll have lots of opportunities in the next 3 years to make principled fights, to continue winning the battle of ideas, and someday we're going to translate that into actual action. So thank you for your efforts in that.